George was born in a small town where there weren't many opportunities for people. In fact, it was a place where most people struggled to find work, get good education, or even have fun. For someone like George who couldn't speak, things were even harder. From a very young age, George realized that the world wasn't made for people like him. It wasn't designed for people who couldn't talk. This was not just a small problem for George. It was a big challenge every single day. He couldn't ask for help or talk to others easily, and sometimes it felt like nobody could understand him. But George was strong and he never gave up. Even though he couldn't speak, George always found other ways to communicate. He used his hands to make signs, he wrote notes, and sometimes he would just do his best to make people understand through his eyes or a simple smile. His parents worked very hard. They loved him, but at first they didn't know how best to support him. They didn't understand his world of silence, and they were confused about how to help. But George learned quickly how to take care of himself, and he grew up adapting to whatever challenges came his way. He was strong and brave, and he made the best of every situation. George was the only child in his family, and even though things were tough, he always felt proud of himself. He worked hard at everything he did, even though others sometimes doubted him. George always believed that no one could ever define what he could do just because he couldn't talk. His abilities were not limited by his silence. One special afternoon, George decided to go to a busy restaurant in the town. This was a big day for him because he had just completed a very hard online course, something many people thought he could never do. George had worked really hard on the course and had finished it all on his own. This was a huge achievement for him and he felt really proud. So, he wanted to go out and celebrate. He wasn't the type of person who celebrated with big parties or with a lot of noise. For George, this simple act of eating alone in a restaurant was enough to make him happy. The restaurant wasn't fancy, but it was a nice, cozy place. There were old photographs on the walls, and the sunlight came through the windows, filling the room with warmth. George liked the way the space made him feel. It wasn't too loud or busy, and it seemed like the perfect spot to have a quiet meal and enjoy his little celebration. George was used to being alone sometimes, but he didn't mind. He was strong and independent. However, as soon as he sat down at the table, he realized something. He had forgotten his blue-covered notebook. That notebook was important to him because he used it to write down what he wanted to say when people didn't understand his sign language or gestures. It was something that made him feel more comfortable when talking to people. Without it, he wasn't sure how he would be able to communicate. For a moment, George felt uncertain. He could leave the restaurant and go back home to get the notebook, but he didn't want to do that. He had already made the decision to celebrate here, and he didn't want this small problem to stop him. So he decided to stay. He took a deep breath, smiled to himself, and sat up straight, ready to do his best to make things work. George wasn't a quitter. A few minutes later, a waiter came to his table. The waiter was young and he looked a little rushed. His name was Raymond. He was holding a notepad, clearly busy with other things. Raymond looked at George and quickly asked, "Table for one? What would you like to order?" George didn't speak, but he pointed to the menu on the table. Then he used his finger to show Raymond which dish he wanted. He smiled faintly, trying his best to show he was friendly and polite. But Raymond didn't seem to understand what George was trying to say. Raymond crossed his arms and sighed loudly. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to say, and I don't have time for this right now," he said, looking frustrated. George froze for a moment. He had tried to communicate, but Raymond didn't understand him. Without his notebook, it was much harder to explain what he wanted. For a second, George felt nervous. He had been in tough situations before, but this one was hard and it was making him feel vulnerable. Still, he didn't want to give up. He gestured again, pointing at the menu, trying to show Raymond which dish he wanted. But Raymond wasn't having it. With a shake of his head, Raymond walked away, muttering something under his breath. George felt the stares of the other customers in the restaurant. Some looked at him with pity, while others just tried to ignore the situation, looking away. But George didn't want to be a problem. He didn't want to cause a scene. He just wanted to have a nice meal and enjoy his small victory. Across the room, at another table, there was a man sitting alone. He had been watching the whole thing. He was tall and had a calm way about him. His eyes were focused on the interaction between George and Raymond, and even though he didn't say anything, it was clear he was thinking about what was happening. The man seemed to care, even though he hadn't said a word yet. He just kept watching. A few minutes later, Raymond returned to George's table. He was clearly even more impatient now. "Seriously, you can't even order if you can't communicate." "That's not my problem," Raymond said, sounding annoyed. George stayed calm and he pointed to the menu again. He tried to show Raymond clearly which dish he wanted, but Raymond didn't seem to care. "Man, you're complicating things. "This is a restaurant, not a charity workshop," Raymond said with a laugh, though it wasn't a nice one. It was more of a frustrated laugh. The entire restaurant grew quiet. People were watching, and the uncomfortable silence filled the air. George lowered his eyes, trying to keep calm. He didn't want to make things worse, but it wasn't easy. He had been through tough times before, but this was still hard. Raymond walked away again, murmuring something about wasting time. George felt a lump in his throat, but he didn't give up. He closed his eyes for a second to calm himself. He had faced much worse in life. He was used to challenges. This was just another one. And he was not going to let it ruin his celebration. He would find a way to make it work. The man across the room was still watching. He hadn't said anything yet, but he looked like he was thinking about what to do. George noticed that the man was sitting quietly, his gaze never leaving the scene. Something about the way he looked at everything made it clear that he wasn't just watching for no reason. He was waiting for the right moment to do something. A few more minutes passed and Raymond came back again. This time he was even more annoyed. "If you can't even order properly, maybe you should just leave. It would make everything easier for everyone here," he said loudly. His words stung and the restaurant went completely silent. Everyone seemed to be watching the scene unfold. Some people looked at George with sad eyes, while others pretended not to see what was happening. George felt embarrassed, but he didn't let that stop him. He kept his calm and pointed to the menu again, trying his best to communicate. Raymond didn't even try to understand this time. Instead, he just laughed and said loudly, "This is ridiculous. He doesn't even know what he's doing here." The other waiters in the restaurant heard him and laughed, but the air in the room was tense. Many customers looked uncomfortable. They didn't know what to do. No one stepped in to help George. Through it all, the man at the back of the restaurant continued watching, his eyes fixed on the scene. He was still sitting quietly, but now it was obvious that he wasn't just watching anymore. Something was about to happen. Raymond walked away again, muttering under his breath. But the man's gaze never left the situation. It seemed like he was about to step in and say something, but no one knew for sure what would happen next. The restaurant was silent and everyone waited for the next move. George sat still, determined not to let this situation ruin his special moment. Even without his notebook, he wasn't going to give up. He would find a way to make himself understood. George sat at the table, his face showing impatience. Raymond, the waiter, looked at him and said, "You know, it wouldn't hurt to learn how to order properly. You must have done this before, right?" George blinked a few times, feeling the weight of Raymond's words. He tried to make a simple gesture with his hand, showing that he couldn't speak, but Raymond just stepped back and laughed. I get it. You can't talk. Well, this isn't a school or an inclusion class, it's a restaurant. If you can't tell me what you want, how do you expect me to help you?" The tension in the restaurant grew. Some customers exchanged uncomfortable looks, while others just continued watching, almost as if they were waiting for a show. George remained calm, but his hands began to tremble. He knew the situation was getting worse, but without his notebook, he couldn't find a way to explain himself properly. Raymond let out a nervous laugh and turned to the other waiters, speaking loudly enough for everyone in the restaurant to hear. "Folks, this is turning into a joke. Seriously, he can't even order food and thinks I'm some kind of magic translator." The other waiters chuckled, but there was a sense of hesitation in their expressions. The customers in the restaurant were uncomfortable, and although no one said anything, it felt as though the silence was almost as loud as the words being said. George kept looking around, trying to stay calm. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, some showing silent support, but nobody said a word. Raymond leaned in toward George once more, his voice dripping with frustration. "Listen, if you can't manage on your own, maybe it's better you just go home. I don't want to be rude, but I'm wasting my time here." George's chest tightened, but he didn't show it. He picked up the menu again, this time pointing at a dish, using big, clear gestures to show what he wanted. Raymond shook his head in response. "Enough," Raymond said. "I've told you if you can't speak, I can't help you." Raymond stepped back from the table and slapped his hand down onto the surface with a loud bang. The plate and silverware on the table shook, startling the people around. A woman sitting at a nearby table looked at her husband as if waiting for him to do something about it, but her husband just turned his head away, not willing to get involved. "Go away, you're causing trouble." "I can't deal with you," Raymond said, his voice harsh. George could feel the heat of tears welling up in his eyes, but he blinked them away quickly, refusing to let his emotions show. He looked around again, noticing that the entire restaurant was watching. Some of the customers seemed to be on his side, but their silence was louder than anything they could have said. At that moment, something unexpected happened. A man sitting in the corner of the restaurant, who had been quietly observing the scene, stood up. His movements were slow and deliberate, but there was a clear sense of purpose in his every step. He adjusted his coat and began walking toward George's table. Every footstep seemed to echo through the restaurant, drawing the attention of everyone present. The air in the room grew even thicker with anticipation as people waited to see what would happen next. Raymond saw the man walking toward George and crossed his arms in a defensive posture, looking puzzled. The man stopped right next to George, his tall figure looming over the table. He stood there, calm but with a presence that was impossible to ignore. His posture was strong like a wall, yet there was no sign of aggression in his body language. Raymond looked up at him, confused, but the man's calm demeanor only seemed to make him more uncomfortable. Then the man spoke, his voice clear and firm. "This ends now." The words seemed to echo throughout the restaurant and everyone fell silent. The man's words were simple but powerful, and they carried an authority that made everyone pay attention. George looked up at the man, a mixture of surprise and silent gratitude in his eyes. Raymond took a step back, looking at the man with defiance, still trying to act tough. "Who do you think you are? This has nothing to do with you. I'm just doing my job here." The man tilted his head, never taking his eyes off Raymond. "I'm just someone who knows how to treat people with respect. Something you clearly haven't learned by now." At this, Raymond seemed to lose some of his confidence. He looked around at the other waiters, perhaps expecting them to back him up, but they all just stood still, their faces full of discomfort. They didn't support Raymond, and their silence was enough to speak volumes. The rest of the restaurant was also silent, watching the scene unfold. The clink of silverware on plates and glasses being set down were the only sounds to be heard. George remained still, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe what was happening. The mysterious man stood by him, facing Raymond with unflinching resolve. Raymond opened his mouth to argue again, but the man raised his hand, signaling that he wasn't done speaking. "Frustrating for you? Imagine how he feels," the man continued, his voice calm but full of strength. "He came here to eat just like everyone else. He deserves to be treated with respect, not humiliated because he can't speak." Raymond opened his mouth to respond but stopped when he saw the man's unwavering gaze. The man didn't seem to care about Raymond's excuses. He was only focused on what was right. The man turned toward George and crouched down to meet his eyes at his level. He gently signed something in sign language that surprised George. "It's all right now," the man signed. "I'm here." George felt a rush of emotion and smiled shyly, feeling both relieved and thankful. He quickly signed back, thanking the man with a grateful heart. The man nodded in understanding and turned back toward Raymond. He picked up the menu from George's table and showed it to the waiter. "Here's his order," the man said firmly. "Now you will treat him with the respect he deserves." Raymond, realizing he had no choice but to obey, sighed in frustration and took the menu from the man. He walked away toward the kitchen without saying another word, though he shot a final look of anger at George and the mysterious man. As Raymond left, the tension in the restaurant seemed to melt away. The customers, who had been silent, began to clap, starting with a woman at a nearby table. Others joined in, clapping in appreciation for what had just happened. But the man who had stood up for George raised his hand gently, signaling for the applause to stop. "It's not about me," he said, his voice calm. "It's about him. Remember that." He turned back to George and signed once more, "Enjoy your meal in peace. You deserve it." George smiled, his eyes full of gratitude and emotion. The man gave him one last nod, turned and walked toward the door, leaving the restaurant behind him. George felt a deep sense of respect and calm, knowing that someone had stood up for him in a way that made all the difference. One last time before going back to his table, George finally felt relaxed, feeling more at ease than any other moment that day. The mysterious man sat back down again, acting like nothing unusual had happened, but everyone in the restaurant knew they had just seen something unforgettable. After the mysterious man spoke up, the restaurant felt completely different. The tension that had filled the air was now replaced by a quiet calmness. A few minutes later, Raymond came back with George's food. This time he didn't say anything. He just put the dish down carefully, almost as if he was trying to show he was sorry for how he acted before. George, still moved by what had happened, nodded to him and thanked him. He started to eat, finally feeling like he could relax after all that had happened. The conversations around the restaurant slowly started again, but something was different. There were more smiles and more friendly glances between the people, like everyone had learned something important from that moment. The mysterious man sat quietly at his table, watching George to make sure he was okay. Then the manager came over. He looked nervous but determined to make things right. He came up to George's table with his hands together and looked sorry. "Sir, I want to say sorry for how our staff acted today," he said, leaning a little bit forward. "What happened was wrong, and I can promise it's not what our restaurant stands for." George listened carefully, nodding slowly. He didn't have his notebook, but he used signs to show he understood. The manager seemed to get it and didn't know what to do next. That's when the mysterious man stood up again and walked over. "He understands your apology," the man said calmly. "But saying it won't happen again is not enough. You need to make sure your staff is trained for situations like this. Training and awareness are very important." The manager quickly nodded, like the man's words made him realize something important. "You're right," the manager said. "We'll start teaching all our staff how to do better. We want everyone to feel welcome here no matter what." George smiled softly, feeling that something good might come out of all this. He signed again and the man translated for him. "He says he appreciates your effort, but respect needs to be more than just words. It needs to be something everyone does all the time." The manager looked at George with new respect, like he had never really thought about it that way before. "You're right," he said. "Thank you. I'll make sure we do it the right way from now on." From that point on, things started to change in the restaurant. Raymond was called into the kitchen for a talk, and even though no one knew what was said, he came out looking quieter and more thoughtful. The other waiters who had laughed before were now more careful and didn't act in ways that could hurt anyone's feelings. When George finished eating, the manager came back to his table with a small smile. "Your meal is on us today," he said. "Consider it a small apology." George thought for a second but then nodded and accepted the offer. Before leaving, he looked toward the mysterious man and signed a simple thank you. The man gave a small smile and a nod back like it was no big deal. As George left the restaurant, one of the customers who had watched everything came up to the mysterious man. He couldn't stop himself from asking, "Why did you do that?" The man smiled a little and said, "Because everyone deserves to be treated with dignity." The customer didn't say anything else. He just thought about what the man said as the man went back to eating, like nothing had happened. Days later, people in the restaurant and even online were talking about what happened. A customer had recorded parts of the interaction, including the moment the mysterious man stepped in. The video quickly became very popular, with millions of views in just a few days. People shared their own stories about times they felt left out or treated unfairly, and the video made more and more people feel kindness and empathy. In the restaurant, things were changing too. Soon after the incident, the manager made a new program for staff to help them learn about treating people with respect and kindness. They even brought in a teacher who could teach the staff some basic sign language. At first, some of the workers didn't like it, but over time they started to see how important it was. Raymond, who had been sent home earlier, came back to work after going to special classes to learn about being more sensitive to other people's feelings. He seemed quieter and more thoughtful, like the experience had changed him. George, on the other hand, started getting messages from people who had seen the video. They sent him words of support and said he inspired them. George never thought of himself as strong, but he was happy that something good came from what he did. A few days later, George decided to go back to the restaurant. This time he brought his blue notebook with him. He knew things were different now, but he still felt a little nervous as he walked inside. As soon as he walked in, the manager greeted him with a big smile. "Welcome back, George. It's so good to see you again." George smiled back and nodded. A waiter led him to his table, and to his surprise, the waiter used some sign language to ask if he was okay and ready to order. The waiter was still a little unsure with the signs, but George was impressed. He smiled and signed his thanks. As he ate, George noticed something new on the wall by the entrance. There was a sign that said, "Everyone is welcome here," with a symbol for inclusion. It was a small but important change that showed how much the place had improved in such a short time. When George was done eating, he looked around the restaurant, feeling at peace for the first time. Then, his eyes caught a familiar figure sitting near the door. It was the mysterious man, as if he knew George would come back. George felt shy, but he walked over to him with a smile. He signed a thank you, and the man smiled back, signing, "Respect is the universal language." George smiled back, feeling moved, and without saying anything more, he left the restaurant feeling stronger than ever. As George walked outside, feeling the warm sun on his face, he didn't notice that the mysterious man was watching him from the window with a small, knowing smile. The man finished his meal, paid the bill, and left quietly as if he had just been a simple customer. But his visit had changed so many people's lives, and they would never forget it. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories filled with adventure, mystery, and excitement. Your support means the world and it helps keep these stories coming. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video.